Hello, everyone. I'm Adrian Sanabria, host of the Enterprise Security Weekly podcast and principal researcher at the Defenders Initiative. Welcome to this webcast sponsored by Gnostic, where Sunil Yu is the CTO and co-founder. Sunil is with me to discuss his company's framework for assessing and remediating Copilot for Microsoft 365. How are you doing, Sunil?
I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. We are also joined by the wise, lovely, and most quoted individual in InfoSec, Wendy Nather. How are you, Wendy?
Well, I'm very flattered at the moment. Thank you.
And because I said you're the most quoted individual in InfoSec, that makes it true. That is now a true fact. You can put it on Wikipedia.
Hey, as Abraham Lincoln said, don't believe everything you read on the internet, right?
Right.
He did say that, yes. So before we get started, I just want to throw out a few words about the navigation here. You as the audience can chat with each other in the, if you look at the blue bubbles down below, the very first one of those on your left is the studio chat or the attendee chat. And then there's also a Q&A button, that blue button in the middle you can use for Q&A. And feel free to submit questions as we go through here, and I'll be checking for those. I'll be checking the chat, and if any of your questions fit into what we're talking about, we will bring them in and we'll answer your questions. You can also leave them to the end, but no promises on whether or not we'll have time at the end to take them. So get them in when you can. All right, so let's jump into it. So today, really everything we're talking about centers around the value of enterprise data and how we use data in the enterprise. And with zero trust being discussed so much, I think it makes a whole lot of sense for systems. When we're with privileges and systems and things like that, zero trust makes a lot of sense. But the more you make it difficult to work with data, the harder it is to do anything of value, to collaborate with other organizations, to do your job in a lot of cases. So let's start off with that, Sunil. What made you decide this was the right thing to do? And was this something that you had seen just on and off in your career, and you decided there needed to be a solution to this? Just employees being frustrated about their inability to access data and use the data that they need. That guiding principle?
There's a lot of content that we have in enterprises that are just waiting to be discovered, and oftentimes we struggle or are frustrated because it's hard to find it, and the institutional knowledge that's locked up really inhibits our ability to get work done more effectively. And so when we look at the revolution that's hitting many enterprises today around large language models, what they're doing is freeing up our ability to get access to that content as well. It's accelerating our ability to find useful content that helps us do our job faster and more efficiently, and so on and so forth. You framed this initially in the context of zero trust, but let me also frame what the new problem is as well. So if you think about zero trust, originally that was applied to networks, right? Mm-hmm. We said, hey, when we first roll out networks, they oftentimes are flat, and we assume everyone is trusted, and so everyone can get access to a lot of things within the network. We've of course realized maybe that's not a great idea from a design standpoint, so we come up with zero trust as a principle. Well, in the same way, when you first roll out a large language model inside of your enterprise, sort of like if you roll out, for example, Copilot inside the enterprise, it flattens your knowledge space. So like a flat network, your knowledge is both readily reachable. So you have a lot of knowledge that's reachable, which is great because now you can get institutional knowledge faster. But all the things that you kind of wanted to make sure was properly safeguarded and hidden and not reachable, guess what? That becomes reachable as well. And so you get both the good and the bad. And the principles that we applied in zero trust networks, we want to see how they apply when it comes to data as well.
And Wendy, typically, I know you've been in government and education to boot. Typically in those kinds of environments, at least the stereotype is there's a lot less controls around data, a lot more open access to data. And you've been in a lot of different environments, highly regulated environments as well. What is the, is this been kind of a holy grail for you as well, like finding a way to both secure the data but enable access to it?
Yeah, this has been a problem for, as long as I've been in security. And, we started out with pretty crude measures with data where, we would basically look for strings and try to stop them at the firewall. And that has evolved since then into looking at what you can infer or derive from different kinds of data sets. So, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, for example, um, mandates that you cannot release any data that can be used to identify an individual student. And when you have very, very large data sets, you need additional help combing through this. When I was at the Texas Education Agency, we were required by legislation to supply certain types of data to researchers, but we had to sanitize it first to make sure that it met the requirements of FERPA. So we actually had quantitative analysts on staff. Usually you see those only in trading houses, in banks, but they had to analyze the data to see if you could reduce it down to a sample size of 4, which is the threshold that FERPA operated at, and make sure that you could not identify an individual student. And this was great, and we would spend time sanitizing the data, and then we would hand it over to the researchers, and the researchers would go out to the school districts and get back the data that we had taken out, like the social security numbers, and they would re-weaponize the data, and there was nothing that we could do about it. So there are those sorts of things that complicate it. I also like to talk about what I call the chemistry of data, which is when you combine different types of data. Again, you can infer or derive certain things, but there's
Yeah.
another element to it, and that is time, because there are times when, before or after a business event, for example, when the security requirements of the data changes, like when you have a press release on a project called Biscuit or whatever, and you're looking for the string Biscuit and you don't want anybody posting it anywhere until you release the press release, and then suddenly you want everyone to see it, and your security controls have to change to accommodate that. So another thing that we have always had to worry about but have not been very good at is looking at, okay, what is the data that somebody wants access to, and from a business perspective or from a time perspective, is it still under the same controls that it needs to be, or have things changed because something else has changed over time?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
one of the challenges that we're seeing overall with the evolution of technology is simply that we've tried to tackle this problem at this very granular level of looking at, for example, as Wendy said, regex strings and these pattern matches and so on and so forth. But because these large language models are able to, as Wendy said, infer things to do the data chemistry. I love that term. To do the data chemistry that combines data in different ways to produce really new value, but also new hazards. And we have all these ingredients inside of an organization that these LLMs are now able to combine very efficiently to let us know about things like layoffs, upcoming layoffs, or what might be the quarterly results for
Mhm.
what the sales are going to be for this next coming quarter. And even if you don't have direct access to, let's say, content associated with that, the ability to combine these ingredients to do this data chemistry and ultimately come up with what we're calling knowledge, what I'm labeling as a knowledge space, is really fascinating, and it creates, again, plenty of opportunities to accelerate the business, but also potential hazards that we in security really care about.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. And a lot of red teamers understand this intuitively. When they're doing recon, they will look at all sorts of data sets to infer things that you didn't think they could.
Mhm.
And that's another important skill that we need to have: combinations of data scientists, statisticians, and red teamers to look at what you could potentially do with it. I don't think I think in a lot of cases we're still thinking too much in terms of regexes. And if you see this plus this is going to be bad. But as I mentioned, there are things that you can do with the data now, and we may need to go to the other end of the spectrum and say, these are things that you may not accomplish with the data. We don't know or care how you're going to do it. We're not going to let you do it. We're not going to let you accomplish that goal. And so it has to be more goal or outcome oriented rather than method based, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and the way I think I've seen this particular problem is actually going back to the FERPA example that you gave, when the analytic researchers were able to go in and suss out the really sensitive information that they could still derive or infer from whatever data was provided. You'd have to go back and say, okay, let's go back to the drawing board and see if I can make it try to remove any detail that can uncover the privacy of an individual. And I'm sure that was actually a really hard thing to do. In fact, in many regards, it may have been a nearly impossible thing to do. Many privacy researchers are finding that to be the case. And this is a really whole new type of problem that we're trying to deal with. And the kind of controls that we have of trying to, let's say, restrict the data may not actually in the end amount to much. And we're seeing this happen again. This pattern appear itself over and over again. One of the best examples I think I have for this one is if you go back to 2015, 2014 or so, Facebook released this amazing capability called graph search. And it enabled us to find common things amongst our friends, favorite movies, favorite books, favorite restaurants. But it also helped us know, for example, which political party you may be affiliated with. There was no field in Facebook that said political party. And yet Cambridge Analytica was able to use this to amazing effect, to a horrifying effect to some, right? And ultimately, that inferred attribute about us is not something you can easily scrub. Where do you scrub that out of Facebook? You can't. And again, this is a whole new type of problem that we're all facing.
Well, you can. You'd have to delete all your posts, right? Which is what a lot of people have done, right?
Which within an enterprise context, you're losing all that value that you could also tap as well. I mean,
yeah. That's right. So I have a funny story. Speaking of, inferring who, what political party somebody belongs to or whatever, something made the rounds recently, some site where it was using AI to analyze a picture. You could upload any kind of picture, and for marketing purposes, it would try to infer as much as it could about that individual from the picture and then suggest things that you can market to them. Now, I had been in DC a week or two ago working with a committee, and my committee had a DARPA baseball cap that he was wearing. And I didn't realize it was his. I found it in the evening after we had finished having dinner. And so I wore it in the next day, and somebody took a picture of me with it. And when I discovered it was his, I tried to hand it back to him, and he said, no, you can keep it. And so I have this picture of me wearing a DARPA cap. So I uploaded it to this AI, and it decided that I was, probably at some laboratory. I was just in a generic background, and they decided that I was an independent thinker. I was probably voting for an independent party that doesn't exist. It listed all these things and then said, well, we can probably sell her more DARPA swag, and we can probably sell her financial advice. And, it did this whole sort of thing. And it just from what it saw on the cap, and I was wearing a black leather jacket, and it said, obviously, she's exuding confidence and that sort of thing. And I realized that in some ways, this is kind of like a horoscope. That it can apply to anybody, it can apply to nobody, and the danger is in deriving information that we then believe in because we think this was objectively derived, and it really wasn't.
There's two ways to interpret the word horoscope. One is horoscope as a zodiac, and then there's horror as in terror.
Horoscope, yeah.
I can see both happening.
Yeah, and it's it's such a contentious world we live in terms of data at this point. Like some of the biggest fines we see FTC handing out are for companies storing too much data, taking too much of their customer data and never getting rid of it. And then at the same time, some of these companies, their entire business model is to collect data. We have all these data brokers, and like that's not a thing for them. That collecting as much as they possibly can is the business model. So we kind of come up on with AI coming out and RAGs and all that. A lot of people started saying data is the new gold. Reddit and all these companies finding out that they can sell access to their data for people who want to train their AIs for a lot of money. I think it was 60 million for just a single glimpse into Reddit's full data set, like a one-time glimpse. So that's a lot of money. But, then there's the other side of it, which is looking at it saying, well, yes, it's valuable, but it's not gold. It's more like plutonium or something. Yeah. Right. It's more like uranium, where yes, it's very valuable, but also you got to be really careful with it.
It can be very toxic. And sometimes I like to talk about what law enforcement calls precursor chemicals. These are chemicals that can really only be used for a couple of purposes, like creating explosives or creating meth or something.
Yeah.
And for the most part, average people have no business having those chemicals. And we may need to do that with data, where we say these are precursor data elements that you have no business having for any purpose. You should just not have them. And that could go hand in hand potentially with the outcome regulation, like you may not use this data to accomplish this goal. I don't know.
Yeah,
this is why you're the most quoted person in InfoSec. It's a great example right there.
So let me push back on that, because I think that the challenge is that this determination of it's not something that anybody should have is unfortunately the current approach that we're taking with large language models. So if you go into ChatGPT today and say, hey, how do I build a biological weapon? It says, sorry, I can't tell you. And it's a one-size-fits-all approach. Inside of an organization, though, that simply is not going to work, because some people, for example, have a need to know for layoff information, and others don't. And ultimately, so having these right now, we have one size fits all guardrails, and what we really need is to be able to teach LLMs discretion. It's not to say nobody should know; it's to say certain people should know. And the foundation of what we're doing at Gnostic is to create these need-to-know boundaries so that these large language models, independent of what data you might have access to, would be able to say, okay, look, you probably don't have a need to know for how to build a biological weapon just because it's not part of your job description. But for those who actually do have that as a part of their job description, here are the details.
Yeah, you're right. And did you know somebody asked DeepSeek about me when it came out, and DeepSeek said, "I'm sorry, I can't discuss that topic." So it's like, gosh, what did I do?
Maybe there's a billion some people who don't have a need to know for anything that Wendy has. It's to their loss, unfortunately.
So let's pivot a bit here and talk about kind of the current problem that a lot of enterprises are facing. I think once you get to a certain size of an organization, almost 100% of organizations have data hygiene and data governance problems. Data is very messy. We need to know exactly where it is at the moment that we need it, and then after that, we could care less. Right. It just gets discarded. It goes in the back seat of the enterprise car, to use a metaphor.
There you go. I like
the backseat trash can that, you don't see it. So,
you'll eventually smell it.
Eventually smell it. Yes. But, and it seems, I've talked to a lot of people using Microsoft Copilot. So Neil, you've talked to a lot of people. Wendy, I presume you've probably talked to people doing pilots of Copilot, and almost all of them seem to be finding that, this becomes a magnifying glass for all those data hygiene and governance issues. Whereas, somewhere deep, 17 levels deep on SharePoint, there's a JDBC or ODBC file with database passwords and usernames and connection strings in it. But nobody knew that until they asked a question about a database and was like, hey, you want some passwords? Here's some passwords. Clear text.
Yeah, there's a lot of latent risk. And what Copilot does is it accelerates the discovery of that latent risk. And again, the acceleration is something that we are looking for when it comes to finding institutional knowledge. We just don't want to find all these other hazardous chemicals that we talked about earlier, or at least rather ensure that those hazardous things are provided to those who do have a need to know and not for those who don't. And Microsoft, when they talk about how to fix this, they offer a number of recommendations and suggestions for how to address this problem. But there's a couple flaws in their approach. First is, they do make a recommendation: go check for oversharing. And the thing is that they don't really give you much guidance on how to do it. And so what we've done is we've come up with a very systematic way to go through a wide range of different topics, sensitive business topics that you don't really, you can't. The way that we've done data discovery in the past is by string matches, the regex strings that we look for. But they don't really work for, like, how do you look for layoff information?
Screenshots, right?
Or non text based media. And so, but these large language models are able to actually work really well at discovering these topical based content without having to provide string match based content. And so our view is, why not use tools like Copilot itself to accelerate that discovery before your employees do? And what we've done is we've automated that process to systematically go and find things as quickly as possible across a wide range of different topics, and from the vantage point of different user profiles within the organization. And through this more rigorous and more systematic approach, we're able to very quickly discover things that would have otherwise been missed by your DLP scanners or your data scanners or your DLP scanners, and so on and so forth. So anyway, it helps a lot of folks accelerate their data discovery programs and even their data classification programs, because now we're able to also provide topical level classification of some of their content.
I think that's super important, because one thing that we have experienced over all this time is the struggle with using humans to perform classification, data classification. And, they will do all this calculation, what can be inferred and that sort of thing, and look at the equivalent of regexes and say, okay, this should be classified this. The problem is, in enterprises, people do not want to have meta thoughts about their data, which is why we have not seen great success in translating this classification schema to, into the civilian world, if you like. Nobody who is writing a memo wants to do those meta thoughts about who should be seeing it, what control should I put on it. So the more you can provide and say, these are the purposes to which somebody could use this, it saves them from having to do it, because they just want to get the thing written and done.
Yeah, and this is something that so the principle that I mentioned earlier is this principle of need to know. And that's a foundational principle that's been articulated in access control guidance from the beginning, right? But we haven't had the technology or the will to do it properly in the past. Now we have the technology, and if you want to use AI, you will need to find the will. Okay, and the perspective around the classification or the sensitivity classification that we typically put on these things, it's not adequate for really what we need in the current AI generation. If anyone who's been in the national security space knows, just because you have a secret clearance doesn't mean that you have a need to know for all things secret.
Right.
So just because I put a secret label on a document or a confidential label on a document doesn't mean that everyone has a need to know for it. So the labels that we have today, which is just these high level sensitivity classifications, isn't gonna be sufficient for what we need in the world of Copilot. What we need for Copilot to now have is these topical level classifications that help us understand, is this actually appropriate for the individual or the group that's trying to look at this content. So it is taking it a step further and giving an assist to the people who need to weigh in on what does this document pertain to, And those topic level classifications will move us forward in being able to have a better way to constrain need to know.
It's interesting. And I mean, that use case goes far beyond just cybersecurity. We're using that in podcast and media publishing today. I can't publish one of my podcasts without a title, a description, some show notes, and categorization. The way we do it here at CRA, there's 3 different categories that have to be completed, and then you can publish it. And that's one of the things we're playing around with is since we have a transcript, a text transcript of the entire piece of media coming out, how good a job can it do at producing that title, the abstract, and the categories? And right now it's doing a pretty good job. Pretty good job of all 3 of those things. It's getting the voice quite right, because again, this is something that's going to be used in marketing. It's going to make people want to click it. You don't want it to sound like a mediocre mid-level marketing manager produced it, right? You want it to sound like the people on the podcast, more. But yeah, if we can use it for that, why not for data classification?
Yeah,
you can't just have AI, just add this one weird trick to every title, and that will get people to click on it.
You probably can.
The 10 things that you need.
I don't know if people will click on it, but you can get it to try. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, in the business use cases, there's a lot of things that, of course, AI can assist us with, and this is just one of those things. But when it comes to access control, this is again another place where we've struggled to do this, and the struggle has manifested with a lot of frustration in many different areas. I'll give you an example of this. So earlier you were saying that this isn't just a security thing. Well, it's like 100,000% agree, because what we start seeing is a very clear indication that the business side understands. In other words, the business understands who should or should not be able to see layoff information. Today, we do access control in this machine-oriented way where we don't really understand what accesses we're giving people. We give access to somebody. We give some person access to this folder or to some server or whatever, or even some file. And now later on, some manager is supposed to do some access review that says, is this access appropriate? Well, a machine understands what that means when I give somebody access to a system, but what is the business context behind that? What we're able to do now is to provide that business context so that when we do an access review, it becomes super obvious and evident. And the access that review that someone is doing is so infused with business context that the business people understand what the implications are. It's not a security issue when somebody when somebody who is unauthorized to have access to layoff information gets access to layoff information. The business side intuitively understands the nature of that concern and takes action on it. It's not, you don't have to describe CVE, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's like, whoa, what is going on here? How come someone has access to this sensitive business content? We got to do something about it. And the actions that they take is just, again, intuitively obvious to them because it's business.
Yeah, they do understand. In a lot of cases, they can't always verbalize what those formulas are, but they know they have them. They just can't figure out how to encode them,
That's right.
in something else to do it for them. Yeah.
And these AI tools now are helping us do that encoding, and it's just now a matter of streamlining it and putting it into people's workflow so that they can take action on it.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the business, to some extent, even if it's not at the individual document level, like you can't close this document until you choose some categories and classify this data, right? But still at some level, somebody has to determine that need to know, because
Mm-hmm.
what you have here is what I call, from the vendor's perspective, and the buyer's perspective, the curse of customization, or the customization tax,
Mm-hmm.
which is, the vendor can only do so much to make this product valuable for you. And then the customer that buys it is going to have to do some extra stuff to make it work for them and how they do business, how they use the product. Like, for example, some organizations' salaries are open. Everybody can see everybody's salaries, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to that company, the salary that somebody's making, the bonus that they made, is open information, open to the public even in some cases. And, like government, for example, whereas in other companies, it's considered very confidential, so at some point, correct me if I'm wrong here, Sunil, somebody has to determine what need to know is for their company, for their data.
Yeah. So in many organizations, we can baseline a initial set of need to know policies for an organization. But as you pointed out, every organization may be different in terms of how they want to implement such a policy, or they may want to relax it for certain cases. But let me make it even more challenging than that. Within the same company, it will change over time. Okay.
Yeah.
I've heard a great analogy that may be helpful to think about. When you have a company, when you have a startup with, let's just say, two founders, those two founders wear a lot of hats. Each hat represents a role and a specific need to know. Well,
Yes.
over time, you hire somebody in sales, and you're now handing over a dozen hats to that salesperson. Okay, with that hat comes a corresponding need to know. Now, that salesperson may hire 10 other people, well, and each person may get their respective hat. Again, each hat comes with a specific need to know as well. That individual that wore 20 hats has a pretty broad need to know, but each hat corresponds to some boundary of what they're supposed to know and not supposed to know. And as you grow and as you hand out these hats, the people the need to know profile of each person starts to change as well. And this is pretty dynamic in every organization. And so just my point is simply that your need to know profiles today may change tomorrow because your organization itself adapts. A small startup inside of it's not a small startup, everyone has a need to know for everything. But as it gets bigger and bigger, you start having more knowledge segmentation.
Yeah, Sunil, you're making me sad though, because I'm starting to think that we may be trying to go back into role-based access control, except now for knowledge. And you just, talked about how difficult it is with roles changing and being redefined and everything. That makes it difficult if you have multiple roles, or let's say you're a doctor at a hospital and you have a need to know and a need to access patient data for a lot of patients until you get hit by a bus outside the hospital and get carried back in as a patient. And then presumably in that role of patient, you do not have a need to know the other patient information unless you're a very dedicated doctor and you crawl off the gurney and you go do your rounds, in which case you need the access again.
Or you
So,
operate on yourself.
yeah, or you operate on yourself. Heal thyself. So, how do you navigate the dynamicism, as you were just describing, Sunil, of roles? We know that just fixing access control to the official title in an HR database does not work. It hasn't worked for a very long time, and it's going to work even worse now. So,
Yeah.
yeah, how do we do this?
So I think let me use a network analogy again, just to make it a little easier to grok for our listeners. So first of all, let me acknowledge that defining roles has been an enormous challenge. At one of my previous employers, we spent greater than 8 figures, let's just say like 9 figures, on that type of problem, and feel like we didn't really make as much progress as we'd like. So I'm pretty sure most people's budgets are less than that, and just the fact that we spent that much is eye watering for many people, and still not succeeding. So it's a hard problem using the approaches of the past. But I think these technologies that we're seeing with LLMs are helping us create better definition around what are these roles and their profiles, and what we're saying is their jobs to be done. Because the jobs that they have to get done do correspond to their need to know profile, or they need to know boundaries as well. Let me now go back to my network analogy I was going to mention. So when we think about firewall rules, we don't create firewall rules at the /32 level. For those for our listeners that are not familiar with the network, so /32 being at every IP address level, we don't create rules at an individual IP address level. What we do is we aggregate to a not a /32, but a /24 or /8, let's say. Well, in some respects, we can look at the how we manage the policy and say, okay, let's start at the /8 level. And it may be fairly coarse initially, but over time, we make it more granular and maybe not get to /32, except for very isolated cases, but let's maybe manage it at the /24 level. What is a /24 when it comes to a role? I don't know yet, but it could look something like, let's say somebody, a analyst is like a /8. A financial analyst is a /20, is a /16. Okay. And so you get, hopefully get the idea that over time we get more granular in terms of the nature of the roles itself.
Oh my gosh. Sunil, you always say things that make me think. And the problem is, at first, I can't decide whether I agree with it or not. I have to go away and think about it for a while. And you just threw out another one, mapping IP address ranges to roles and need to know, or maybe need to do. Not just should you have access to these strings or to this container that contains this sort of data, because today we do that. Okay, do you need access to that SharePoint? No, you don't, because it's the finance department's SharePoint. And as you know, we can't necessarily work with that. We also have the problem of delegation, where just for today, I'm going to, do Adrian's job. So I'm going to need to do whatever he has access to, but only for today and for this particular reason. And it needs additional approvals to be able to do that.
Yeah, so let's talk through the delegation point for a moment, because this highlights one of the big concerns as well. So let's suppose you have a CEO and she has an assistant that has access to all her email. Well, does that assistant have a need to know for M&A and layoffs and all these other sort of things? And the answer is no. Does that assistant have access to the CEO's mailbox? Sure. I mean, they can look through it, but do you want to empower Copilot to quickly find that type of content for you? Or should it be restricted to what that assistant has a need to know for, which is, maybe things around scheduling or around coordination or whatever else it might be? The challenge we're going to have is we currently still grant people access to the underlying data, but at some level, people are going to not want to access it at the data level. They're going to want to access it at the higher abstraction level, because it's just much easier and much more efficient. And if you access it at that higher level, we need to, again, put in the need to know boundaries to say, wait a second, your job function has nothing to do with M&A. So the fact that you're asking for it, one, I should deny it, and two, I should alert somebody about the situation. And so that's ultimately what needs to happen at the need to know level. We do have something else that I want to follow up on, but you have something you want to comment on.
Yeah, so there's it strikes me that we see a lot of duplicative work in a lot of corporate environments, because it's difficult to share data. People aren't great communicators. So I imagine, like, in a lot of these cases, you wouldn't even know what data to ask for access to in the first place. Like, maybe you're working on a project and you discover somebody's already completed that project. Like it already exists. It's already been documented. You didn't know because they left the company and they didn't tell anybody. But that spreadsheet's already out there, and it's, if not a good start, mostly complete. And I've seen a lot of this duplicative work happen in enterprises. And I feel like maybe we have an opportunity to solve that problem as we go here.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, so the whole point of LLMs, again, is to help find institutional knowledge faster. And so if someone has already done the work in some capacity and it's related to what you're trying to do, then it should actually share that with you, as long as it's within your need to know boundary. Now, here's the thing that I think is actually more remarkable once we have an understanding of need to know boundaries. What if someone asks a question that is initially outside of their need to know boundary, and instead the LLM comes back and says, here's an answer that's curated or adapted to your need to know boundary? The example I oftentimes give is, like, let's say someone asked you, can you tell me about quantum field theory? Well, you would answer differently if it was a fifth grader versus a high school student versus a PhD candidate, right? So if you're on all hands and someone says, hey, are we going to have layoffs next month? the CEO in an AMA has to still answer the question, but you adapt the answer accordingly. And you deliver the answer in a way that hopefully is still helpful to get their job done, but is within their need to know boundary. So if a marketing intern asks, hey, what's next quarter sales revenue? You could come back and say, well, I can't tell you that directly, but here are the marketing campaigns that contributed most to sales. And from that, you get exactly what you need to get your job done without necessarily, divulging things that are outside your need to know boundary. So that spreadsheet that you're talking about, or whatever content may be, but that you don't actually have access to today, but could be accessible because it's within your need to know boundary, that is unlocking a huge amount of potential value. And that's what I think many enterprises are really looking forward to.
So
I
Neil,
think this.
are we going to train LLMs to do corporate speak now? Give a vague non-answer, because my head is just hurting now.
Earlier, I was saying we're trying to teach LLMs discretion. So in some respects,
Discretion.
yes, but discretion
Oh,
is really tied to, again, need to know policy. What is the need to know policy of the organization? How much corporate speak you want to have the LLM do is ultimately up to each organization. Some people may want to say, look, sorry, I can't tell you, go away. And others will say,
We need a candidness slider bar, where
yeah, yeah.
at one end it's yes, there will be layoffs, and the other end it's pack your stuff, Todd.
that's right.
Yeah, yeah. Or we always consider the current economic environment in making our decision as to whether layoffs will happen within the next quarter. How's that?
Wow, that you rattled that off way too easily.
It's trauma. That's the only way I can explain it. Yeah.
Yeah, but just to emphasize what you're talking about there, Sunil. Like, I love the idea of that. The no but, having computers that instead of giving us a binary answer, yes, the file exists, no, it doesn't, or yes, the data exists, no, it doesn't. But yeah, no, I can't show you that file, but here's some recommendations. Here's something I can do for you instead of just leaving you hanging.
Yeah,
Mhm.
fundamentally, I think it shifts the balance of how we think about what these technologies can do for us. We traditionally look at the security department as the department of and no, right?
Mhm.
No, but. Well, it's actually the but part that's actually more fascinating. It's not the department of NO, it's the department of KNOW, department of no, of here's
Mhm.
actually what you need to get your job done. And that's transformational, in my view, of what security can actually truly empower the business. We talk about security being a business enabler, but what if we actually can be the business enabler by having need to know policy understood and enabling these LLMs, and by the way, LLM agents, to act in a way that stays within those boundaries and gathers content that you don't have access to today, but you should because it's within your need to know boundary. That
Yeah.
is truly business enabling.
Yeah.
It is, and that reminds me of the time that I brought in a security database security tool, and we ran it against some applications, and we found that one query for a particular application against the database took 23 minutes to return. And so somebody in my security team took that to the project manager for that app, and they said, "Oh, that's why we're having performance problems." So yes, if you know the right things, if you have access to the right things and can derive the right things, you can also parcel those out into very useful bits of information for the rest of the business.
Yeah, but let me take what you just said and extend it further, though. It's based on the fact that you have access to those things.
Yeah.
Because you have access, you can get it. But there's a lot of content that we don't have access to, don't even know we have access, that we don't even know exists because we don't have access to it. But these large language models can actually access the whole universe of things within, for example, SharePoint. When you run Copilot through SharePoint, it acts on behalf of who you are to restrain what it can gather. And that's the main basis for how Microsoft tries to constrain access. But the problem is our access is broken in two ways. First way is we are given access to more things than we should. And the second thing is we're given access to less things than we should as well, right? There are things that we should have access to that we don't. And unfortunately, the controls at the lower layers, at the data level, are just not sufficient for this new problem that we're facing. And actually, I don't know if you just have listeners, but let me just give you a quick. I want to give the audience a quick visual of our
Sure.
conceptual breakthrough, because I think it'll help. The picture gives 1,000 words type of thing, right? So our conceptual breakthrough comes from this mental model. I love mental models. And this mental model is called the DIKW pyramid, and it stands for data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. And what we have moved up to is where technologies like Copilot and LLMs really help us become knowledge-driven organizations. But we just talked about all the oversharing that happens at this layer. What we typically see is controls that basically operate at these lower layers. So when I said lower earlier, this is what I meant. We have data and information-centric controls. And those data information-centric controls are really just machine-oriented controls to help us restrict file access or to put sensitivity labels on them. But here's the problem that happens when you constrain these bottom two layers. As we restrict access at these bottom two layers, what happens is we squeeze these bottom two layers, and which causes the knowledge layer to also get squeezed as well. So in this pyramid, what we end up seeing is tools like Copilot, these large language models, become less useful over time. And we think that this is fundamentally the wrong approach. We think that we have a new technology. We need we have a new operating model for this technology, and we need a new way of thinking about this. And this is where Gnostic comes in. We are providing need-to-know controls for the LLMs. And by applying controls at this layer, we think that we can restore the real value of the LLM, but also control what people have access to. For those, again, going back to the network analogy, it's similar to the same problem with the like layer 3 and layer 4 controls versus layer 7 controls. If you want to block Facebook.com, do you do it at layer 3 and layer 4, or do you do it at layer 7? Companies like Palo Alto figured out you need a new type of technology to address a new protocol, a new type of approach for a new operating model. And that's essentially what we're saying. You could try to apply the data and information-centric controls, but fundamentally, it's not going to work as effectively as when you apply the controls at the right layer.
You know, that you just prompted another thought in my head, going back to applying this analogy to network segmentation. And one of the big problems, that we have with network segmentation is we have to try to baseline the activity in order to decide who needs what. And that is the hardest thing for an enterprise to do. And the problem is you have to do it over a long period of time, because there are some events that don't necessarily happen more than, say, once a year or whatever. And I can imagine it'd be the same thing for need to know, where there is something that Adrian only needs to know when the business event occurs, which may be, very rarely, but once it does, okay, now given his role, this applies to him and he needs to know it. So how would you kind of plan this out, with and map out the need to know without necessarily being able to baseline what everybody currently needs to know?
Well, there is a baseline we can use. I'm sorry for keep going back to the network analogy over and over again, but let me use the network analogy again because it may help. With the zero trust approach that we took with networks, we said, okay, we need to microsegment our environment. Well, how do you know what your microsegmentation policy is? Well, we started by looking at something like NetFlow. We said, what does the network, what's the network traffic look like? And tell me what the patterns, what are the patterns that we see in NetFlow? Well, when it comes to the knowledge space with LLMs, we have to do something similar. So earlier I mentioned we need knowledge segmentation. Well, what's our knowledge segmentation policy? What's our need to know policy? So what we do is we create knowledge flows. Okay. And the knowledge flows is that baseline, because the knowledge flows help us understand what should and shouldn't be. Now, are all knowledge flows valid? Not necessarily. This requires somebody to come in and say, wait, why is this knowledge flow happening? Just as much as, a NetFlow, we look at NetFlow and say, why is this application talking over this port? and the the application owner would say, no, we should not include that in our policy. So in the same way, we would have knowledge flows and the evaluation of those knowledge flows to help us determine what the appropriate knowledge policy, the knowledge segmentation policy should be.
But again, that could take a really long time to build up that baseline, because knowledge isn't necessarily flowing. Not all knowledge is flowing all the time.
Agree.
It's very circumstantial.
Right. So you may have to wait a year before you know how to apply a particular policy because it only happens once a year. But again, we come in with a default policy where it's going to be generally more conservative. We're going to say, I don't know if this person should have access to this type of knowledge. And so the override has to happen or rather we would, the organization or the topic owner would have to do an override to allow that to happen.
It seems like this would naturally, this is the kind of process where you'd want some kind of a Slack bot or a Teams bot or something like that saying, hey, so-and-so wants access to budget information, for this cost center. Is that cool? Is that okay?
Hey, keep in mind, that's how we do it today.
Right.
Yeah.
We're like, hey, I need access to to our budget proposal. And there's an implied, okay, here it is because you have a need to know. Right. So now if I can, instead of asking my boss or somebody else to get that information, I can ask an LLM, and the LLM says, I'm not sure, but let me just check with your boss. I mean, it's basically the same process where the boss gives you just in time or some degree of persistent access to say, here, you can have the LLM answer that for you.
And then we have some kind of access reviews or data reviews, or like even our iPhones now are like, this app hasn't used your microphone in 2 months. We're taking away microphone access.
The nice thing about the need to know access reviews is, again, it's so infused with business context that the pain that we typically experience with access reviews is largely addressed. Is it still painful? Yeah, probably. Okay. But at the very least, we're now being able to, the person that's doing the access review has a fighting chance of actually understanding what access I'm actually giving.
So we've got a question. Josh asks, doesn't this require standards from information and data owners to determine topical metadata, need to know, and labeling? Do any such standards exist?
They do. So absolutely, great question. The notion of a topic taxonomy is not something that is well captured in the industry at this point, but there are some, for lack of a better word, standards around this. So, for example, DoD
Data
has
catalogs. Been doing that since the 90s.
Yeah, we're talking those sensitive topics, not just any topics. I mean, you can do a wide range of topic classification, but what we're trying to focus on right now is those things that are generally considered to be sensitive enough that you'd want to constrain access to those things. And so controlled unclassified information that DoD has is an example of such a taxonomy that we can start with. Is it perfect? No, there's nothing, and there's never going to be something that's perfect. But we got to, let me go back to my earlier comment. We've had this problem forever, right? This is not a new problem. But we lack the technology and the will to do it. I think we have the technology now to at least give us a major assist, if not really help us get to the point where we can do this really effectively. But I also mentioned, if you want to use AI inside of your enterprise, then guess what? You're going to have to find the will to do it as well. And I think that's really the driver for a lot of what the business that we're seeing.
Yeah, good point from Thomas here also, talking about the value of information being contextual / dynamic. And just like we have like break glass accounts for like incident responders, for example, I imagine we would need something similar here as well, also for incident responders, or, I don't know all the different situations you might
define an incident, M&A.
Right. Yeah, M&A, sure. Due diligence, right?
Right.
Yeah. So here's a couple of ways to think about this one. If there is a situation where things are urgent and you need direct access to something, then you shouldn't actually remove that direct level of access. Let me go back to my pyramid for a moment. Back in the day, when we first had only databases, you'd give people database level access. People could write SQL queries in the database, right? Eventually, we wrote applications on top of that database. what would you do to all the people who had SQL level access to a database? What you'd actually remove it, right? Like not only from a security standpoint, but most people would just say, why do I need to go through a database and ask SQL queries when I could just use the application? Well, what we have is a new abstraction through the LLM, and that LLM allows us to get the content that we need at the lower levels. What that means over the longer term is we can remove access at the application level, and certainly again at the database level. But there are going to still be database administrators. There are still going to be people who need to break glass and be able to get something really quickly when they need to. So, but the general patterns that we'll see is people coming in from the knowledge layer down. So anyway, the point is, we're not saying some of the old patterns will go away completely, but I think a lot of the headaches that we see at those with those older patterns will largely go away.
I can see the same sort of thing that you're describing, except for, what if there's an application to do database queries, why would you need to do SQL queries directly? And the answer is always because that application's stupid and it's not doing the query the way I want to. And I can absolutely see people having to bypass the LLM because the model is not supporting what they want. Is that something you've run into, Sunil?
Oh yeah, yeah. Let's just be. Copilot wasn't always that well. It's getting better, but these LLMs are definitely getting better. Early days they were not so great, but they're getting surprisingly better. And I think that's both a delight, but also a consternation for other reasons. But that's it. Well, people still want to use a bypass to get directly to some content, sure, especially if they've built long-standing processes or automation, around those things. They'll continue to do that just because it's the most efficient process that they already have. But again, like the bulk of us are going to start shifting over into this new model, and we just need the proper controls at that new model. When and again, it alleviates a lot of it allows us to back off on some of the controls that we have at the lower levels because we could basically just remove them.
Yeah. So, anything else you want to touch on, Sunil, before we tackle some more of these questions and wrap things up here?
I did see a question from Barb about what's the business case for this, and
that was the next one I was going to go to.
Yeah, yeah. So the easiest business case is simply this: we have a lot of overshared content inside your enterprise today. What if you found a way to accelerate the discovery of that? Which is the first and foremost what we do. We go and help accelerate the discovery of things that are overshared because what we're doing is we're applying a need-to-know template on top of your data. Okay. And so that allows us to quickly find things that should be addressed right now, regardless of whether you plan to roll out Copilot or any sort of enterprise AI search tool. That's the main business case. Or that's one of the key business cases. Is it expensive? I don't. I mentioned earlier at a prior employer, we spent lots of money on different things, but we are not aiming for that kind of budget here. We're talking basically, basically, 5-figure type of things to get this done very quickly in a very short time frame. And that was annual, by the way, not monthly. But hey, if you want to pay that monthly, that'd be great too. But anyway, it's very efficient, and we priced it in a way that I think people will find very attractive, especially in light of all the other solutions out there that are way, way more expensive. And I used to run programs like that at my prior employer, and they are very expensive. They take forever to complete, and we end up with tons of false positives. And we've tried to address all those with a much more efficient solution.
Hey, Adrian, remember when we were at 451 Research, and I think it was you who described some new product we were evaluating as a SIM for your SIM?
Yeah,
and
I did.
We get to the point where what you need to do is so complex that you're going to need another product to do it. And I can very well see this being the same sort of situation where if you already have Copilot, and you may not have any choice as to whether you have Copilot, but if you want to bring it under control, if you want to automate certain things, as Sunil's been describing all this time, I can see the business seeing that as short-term value maybe not ROI, I hate that term, but short-term value as opposed to the longer-term second order value of understanding where all your stuff is, and every so often bringing out something you didn't know you had. They may not appreciate the longer term value returns, even though they're also there. But the short term things like, we can automate this and that and the other thing, and this is going to save everybody time, and the discovery comes along with it. Then that may be a better line to take with them.
Yeah. The short-term value that we provide is exactly what you said in terms of finding that overshared content and quickly remediating that. But I would say even the longer-term view is that understanding the need to know boundaries of your organization. It's something that needs to be established.
I think to Sunil's point, Copilot's more the match that started this. It's created the pressure point.
They started the fire.
If we're honest with ourselves, this is something we've needed for a long, long time anyway.
Yeah.
All right. And with that, thanks to our sponsor, Gnostic, for making today's webcast possible. And thank you both, Sunil and Wendy, for joining me today. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
And finally, a big thanks to the audience. You're the reason we do this, and we will see you next time.